Good morning, everyone. My name is Natalie Duncan, and I'll be presenting today on science-based targets, net zero, and a bit around carbon offsetting as well. And for today's presentation, you can call me Natalie Duncan. And my name is often misspelled this way. And if you're confused on why I'm bringing this up, I think it'll make sense soon. Bear with me. Okay, so for a bit of an overview of today's workshop, there are five main learning objectives that we will address. So the first one is what makes a good emissions reduction target and what makes a target science-based. We'll look a little bit into how supply chain data can support target achievement, and then also a brief discussion on how net zero differs from carbon neutral, as well as what good offsetting looks like, because these are often topics that come up when companies are thinking about setting emission reduction targets, and it can be very confusing. So let's start off with what makes a good emission reduction target? What are the hallmarks of a good target? This conversation today is actually going to be mostly about donuts. So I'm going to pose a question to you. What if I told you that I am committing to eating 50% less donuts? Your first reaction might be, that's great. That this is a commitment that will likely improve your health. Everyone should commit to eating 50% less donuts. But what I think you'll learn today is that this target is missing key pieces of information for you to really understand if this is a good commitment. A better way to describe the target that I'm committing to would look like this. I am committing to eating a certain percent less donuts over a certain time frame, maybe over the next year, from a baseline of a certain amount of donuts. So the first key element of this target is how many donuts are you eating today? I think if I told you that I was eating 20 donuts a day and that I was committing to eating 50% less, you might look at me a little strange, as opposed to I'm eating 5 donuts a month and I'm committing to reduce that by 50%. You might also want to know, well, what reduction in donuts does your doctor recommend? Maybe my doctor thinks I need to reduce my donut consumption by 90% because I'm eating a lot of them. We don't really know how healthy a 50% reduction is without this type of information. And then lastly, we can come back to this question of time frame. Am I reducing my donut intake within a month, or am I going to try and get there over the next year or 2 years? This is important information in order to know how long my commitment is going to last and also how quickly I'm going to reach my target. So this is definitely a silly example, but I'm going to use the consumption of donuts throughout this presentation as an example to kind of teach you about these concepts related to science-based targets. And what we learned here is that there are three components of a good emission reduction target. The percent reduction should be informed by scientific consensus. The emission reduction target should state the target year, the time frame in which I aim to achieve the target. And I should also have a stated baseline against which we can measure and track progress to make sure I'm actually achieving what I set out to do. What this looks like in terms of emissions instead of donuts often looks like this. Company X commits to reduce scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions X% by 20X from a base year of 20X. And this is a really common target outline for how companies are communicating their emission reduction ambitions. So I pulled an example, it's publicly available, just to show you kind of what this looks like in real life. This is part of a building product company's near-term commitment, which says that the company commits to reduce absolute scope 1 and 2 GHG emissions 30% by 2030 from a 2019 base year. All of the elements of a good emission reduction target. As part of the three components of a good emission reduction target, I brought up this concept of the percent reduction being informed by science. So let's dig a bit deeper into what makes a target science-based. A science-based target aims to reduce emissions in line with what the latest climate science deems is necessary in order to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. That goal being to try to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees C above pre-industrial levels. And for those listeners who may follow climate information more closely, you might be asking, well, haven't we already surpassed 1.5 degrees of warming? And yes, the consensus is that we're already in this territory of dangerous levels of warming. But this remains the goal of the Paris Agreement with the hope of bending the curve on temperature rise and staying at least below 2 degrees C. So if you're interested in learning more about kind of the science behind this, there is a webinar available from Josie Brownell on the US Supply Chain Sustainability School website. It's called An Introduction to Climate and Carbon. One way to think about what climate scientists deem as necessary to keep emissions under a certain level is to visualize these reductions on a path from today towards the future. So if we come back to this donut analogy, we can measure the number of donuts that are eaten today by the global population. And in order to stay healthy, let's just say doctors say that the global population should reduce the amount of donuts eaten by a certain amount over time towards zero. A science-based target that's formulated for the near term is usually around 5 to 10 years out from the year that it's set. So this gives us a midway point to understand our progress towards a healthier level of consumption of donuts. In the longer term, which climate scientists consider to be around 2050, we will have reduced our donut consumption, but there will still be some level of donut consumption that will happen beyond 2050. Some donuts are still going to be eaten. But going forward, when we reach this level of residual donut consumption, we can offset the amount of donuts by eating an equal amount of broccoli. So let's swap out donut consumption with greenhouse gas emissions production. Similarly, global emissions production should reduce over time to a certain residual level of emissions beyond 2050. After that, these residual emissions are offset by capturing and storing an equal amount of emissions. This is where the concept of carbon offsets becomes introduced, which will be required in these kind of long-term timescales when we reach residual emission levels. Climate scientists and doctors, you could say, agree that it's hard or impossible to get the global population to eat zero donuts or produce zero emissions. So, no matter what you think about broccoli, we will need some form of removal offsetting tool. One of the challenges of this and of climate science is that the climate is a global system, so it spans the entire globe. So we need to find a way to translate our understanding of what's needed in terms of global emission reduction to the reductions that are needed at the industry level and all the way down to an individual company scale. And this is a challenging feat, but thankfully we have the Science Based Targets Initiative, or SBTI. This is an organization whose whole mission it is to define these global emission reduction targets and what climate scientists are saying down to the level of individual companies. And in practice, if we come back to the donut analogy, SBTI gives guidance to determine how many donuts each person or industry eats today and what's a reasonable reduction pathway going forward to 2050. As you can imagine, different people eat a different amount of donuts and have a more or less feasible path to reducing that number to something that's healthy. So a person with a higher natural metabolism than another person may be able to healthily eat more donuts. There may also be a couple of different people who all have maybe a similar natural rate of metabolism, who are all eating right now a different number of donuts. But doctors have mapped a path for each of these people to converge, to eat the same amount of donuts that's healthy for kind of this group. In the world of emissions, different industries may have different required or feasible rates of reduction, and different companies within one industry might be starting at different emission levels, but all need to converge to the same target level of emissions. Based on what climate science and SBTI have determined to be each industry's emission budget, SBTI has quantified a general percent reduction plan that's applicable for most companies. The science-based reduction for most companies is a 4.2% linear annual reduction in Scope 1 and 2, and a 2.5% linear annual reduction in Scope 3. Some high emitting industries, or if you come back to the donuts, some people who particularly love eating donuts and eat a lot of them, have individual guidance to transition towards lower emissions over time. So SBTI does have industry specific guidance that kind of supplements these general percent reduction plans. In addition, SBTI outlines some more specific requirements for companies to set and achieve their targets. I won't go into all the details here. The purpose of today's webinar isn't to share with you exactly how to formulate an SBTI target, but rather what goes into it. But in general, you're required to formulate your target in a way that's consistent between other companies, so that the ambition and the progress can be compared, and it allows companies to be held accountable for progress on their emission reduction targets. There is an important lesson within what we're talking about, which is that the SBTI, the Science Based Targets Initiative, does not equal science-based targets. And what I mean by that is a target can be science-based without being validated by the SBTI. However, SBTI does help companies set and validate targets to ensure that they are indeed science-based. So this kind of reveals the value of third-party verification or validation. SBTI now means something in the market. Companies may be asked to have SBTI validated targets because there is a certain amount of value in having an independent third party sign off on your target, make sure that it matches the criteria that makes your target aligned to the best available science. So there is value in the market to that. Just noting here that SBTI isn't the only organization that's helping companies set emission reduction targets. There are a number of different ones in the market. You may have heard of the Climate Pledge or Exponential Roadmap. ISO is also coming out with their own net zero guidelines. The British Standards Institute, or BSI, has a standard on carbon neutrality. That is different from net zero. We'll talk about that in a future slide. But in general, SBTI has kind of risen to the top in terms of adoption and acceptance in the market. Now I'm going to discuss how supply chain data can support target achievement. And first, I want to give an example of a typical manufacturer's emission profile. So this is an example of a tier 1 contractor, and the chart on the left shows the company's direct or operational emissions in that bar chart. But when you zoom out to include its supply chain emissions, the operational emissions are often only 1 to 5% of the total emissions picture. So engagement and collaboration with the supply chain is critical in order for companies to actually achieve emissions reductions. When beginning to address supply chain emissions, the first step that companies often take is to measure their baseline. So if you remember, this slide outlined the 3 components of an emission reduction target, and a key step is having a stated baseline against which you measure your progress. So let's look into how supply chain emissions can be baselined and measured. In order to establish the baseline, we need to kind of go back to basics. And for that, we're bringing back donuts, but in a slightly different way this time. So now we are role playing as a donut manufacturer. So the first thing I need to do is take an inventory of my operations. What am I buying to run my business at all of the donut plants? And companies are doing this every year to conduct their baseline inventories. They're looking at all of their activities within a year and looking to measure the impact of these activities. In the world of donuts, you could think of the measurement of these different ingredients in terms of calories. So we know that the flour in the donut contributes 8 total calories, whereas maybe the yeast is only 1, sugar is 7, and so on. So in total, based on what the donut is made of, we can calculate that the donut contains 26 calories. And I guess in this case, we're making mini donuts. So from that, we can then map out the ingredients based on their contribution to the total calories within the donut. Now, let's say I'm a particular type of donut manufacturer. I am a donut maker that is trying to reduce the calories in my donut to as close to zero as possible. I don't know why. It's maybe the new weight loss trend is 0 calorie donuts. I don't know. So I know what's contributing the most to my donut calorie profile, and I'm going to think about how I may be able to reduce the calories per donut. And this is the same exercise that we would do to measure baseline greenhouse gas emissions. What materials do you buy, and what's the environmental impact of each material? And companies who have emission reduction targets use this baseline information to make decisions, right, on where to begin engaging their suppliers. For my measurement, I know that sugar and flour contribute the most to the total calories, around 58% from these two ingredients. So we can consider these as our hotspots where we should begin focusing our attention. Let's restate this donut manufacturing example into the language of greenhouse gas emissions. We can say that from our inventory work, we know that the majority of emissions come from two raw materials, sugar and enriched wheat flour. In order to reduce the emissions, we need to engage the suppliers that supply us these raw materials. And there are two goals with this engagement. First, we want to collect primary data on raw material emissions. So for this, we would need to ask the supplier for the actual emissions they've measured, which will allow us to replace the estimates that we've made. It may be standard to report calories per ingredient, but it's not standard right now to report emissions per raw material. So we often need to make estimates, and we want to clean these up to be sure that we're targeting the right hotspots. That's the first goal. Second, we'll want to be able to track raw material emissions over time to ensure that our suppliers are also working to reduce their emissions and that we're able to document and report that every year. Having a good handle on where my hotspots for emissions are, what is the primary emissions data for these raw materials, and how the emissions of these raw materials are changing over time allows companies to track emission reduction efforts that are happening upstream or sometimes downstream of their operations where they have much less visibility. It also allows companies to theoretically prioritize buying from suppliers who are tracking and really trying to reduce their impact over time. And we're seeing this happen in the procurement landscape more and more, this kind of prioritized buying or preferred supplier selection based on who is tracking and reducing their impact. So I've put on screen a couple of commonly used methods that we're seeing to collect supply chain sustainability data. One of the big ones that you might be familiar with is EcoVadis, which asks you to provide information on your ESG efforts. Similar questionnaire is CDP. We've also seen requests for suppliers to have PACT aligned data, PACT aligned data to share with customers. This just refers to product level emissions information. So again, another way for suppliers to report out their emissions so that their customers can baseline and track progress. There's a lot more to say here on this topic, but for future discussions on the role of the supply chain the role of supply chain data sharing in achieving sustainability goals, I do recommend to stay up to date on the US Supply Chain Sustainability School website. There are a lot more webinars and training resources available on this topic. I want to step back briefly just to talk about this concept of net zero and how it differs from carbon neutral. So, we've been talking up until now about what it takes for an emission reduction target to be science-based to achieve net zero ambition, but we haven't talked yet about the concept of carbon neutral. Carbon neutral and net zero are similar, but they do have important differences. Carbon neutral usually only focuses on one greenhouse gas. It's in the name, carbon, whereas net zero covers all types of greenhouse gases. Carbon neutral generally focuses on operational neutrality, so usually only scope 1 and 2, whereas net zero almost always covers scopes 1, 2, and 3. Carbon neutral doesn't really have a defined ambition for carbon reduction over time, whereas net zero ambition is usually aligned with the recommendations of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, which is the leading scientific body on climate change. Carbon neutral also allows for offsetting, and that's part of the reason why there's not a defined ambition for reduction, because at any point along this reduction pathway, carbon neutral allows for an equal amount of offsetting. Net zero does not allow for offsetting, except in the longer term when there are residual emissions. And I want to zoom in on this last point because it really is the key differentiator between carbon neutral and net zero. If we come back to this graphic from earlier in the presentation around net zero targets, we brought up this concept of residual donut consumption. And this reflects the understanding that it's probably not possible to get donut consumption, emissions production, or anything down to zero. There will always be some sort of residual something. So in net zero, beyond a certain time frame, the offsetting of these residual emissions is allowed. Versus for carbon neutral, there's an equivalent amount of broccoli being eaten at any of the interim years up to 2050 and beyond. So this actually gives you the ability then to claim carbon neutrality in any year. You can say, my company produces carbon neutral products, or my company's operations were carbon neutral in 2025. Whereas for net zero, your claims may sound more like, we have set a target to achieve net zero by a certain date, or we're on the path to net zero. So it sounds a little different, and the type of communication that's allowed also creates different reactions in the marketplace. And again, broccoli here, broccoli florets equal carbon offsetting. The conversation around carbon offsets can be tricky because it can feel like by me just eating some additional broccoli, how does that actually have an impact on the fact that I'm still eating some donuts? And if we take that in the language of carbon emissions, I may be trying to capture some carbon by planting trees or saving a forest from being cut down, but I'm still pumping emissions into the atmosphere. So how does that work? Climate scientists actually agree that there is a role for carbon removals to be used to reach net zero by 2050. Again, this comes back to the concept of zero is a very hard number. It's a very absolute number. We know that zero is not realistic. There will always be some level of residual emissions. So there's an understanding that some amount of carbon removal, carbon offsetting is needed. The tricky thing here is that many of these technologies are novel. So if we wait too long to develop these technologies, the cost will remain really high. But if we start to allow companies to purchase carbon offsets and support the development of these new technologies, we may be allowing companies to compensate too early, and we're not entirely sure how effective some of these carbon technologies might be. So we might be creating a bad situation by disincentivizing actual emission reductions on the path to net zero. I just want to show a little graphic on the right on how carbon offsets work. So the concept is that carbon offsets should be a supplement to your own emission reduction efforts. So you're reducing your own emissions down to some residual level. You then put money towards some sort of scheme or offset project, and you're investing in that project to help someone else reduce their emissions or remove emissions from the atmosphere. So by investing in that project, you have basically created the ability to reduce the amount of emissions that project would have emitted, and you can claim credit for the amount of reduced emissions. And this amount is the same or should be the same as your residual emissions amount. So together, your residual emissions and the credits that you bought for the avoided or removed emissions are the same. So that's how we reach zero. I think if you take anything from this discussion, there is a role for some sort of offset or removal scheme. And there's also a balance to be struck between waiting too long and allowing the use of credits too soon. I think that if we learn a little bit more too about the fundamentals of carbon offsetting, it can help us better understand what best practices are considered to be in the market. And that can help us know too if we're moving in the right direction. So that being said, to understand this a little bit better, I think it's worth digging into what does good carbon offsetting look like. First, we need to clean up our terminology a little bit. So carbon offsets are generated when an activity removes or reduces carbon emissions from the atmosphere. These offsets are then reported and verified, usually by a verification body. And this verification body then issues an associated number of carbon credits. However, not all carbon credits are equal. Broccoli is not the same as broccoli is not the same as broccoli. And the reason for that is one of the things that makes carbon credits different is their origin story or the type of project that created the offset in the first place. And when we think about types of projects, we can categorize these into two broad categories of offset projects: avoid and reduce and removal projects. The avoid and reduce projects we'll mostly be familiar with. It includes things like the generation of renewable energy, switching to more efficient stovetops, things like that. On the removal side of things, reforestation might be familiar, so growing more trees captures more carbon from the atmosphere. Then we also have technological carbon capture and storage technologies. These removal projects are few and far between, you could say, in the market. They only represent around 20% of available credits. I want to dig a bit deeper into these removal style projects because it is newer and it's in the middle of kind of a huge growth and expansion era. And I want to note too that we usually refer to these as carbon removal projects, but these techniques typically involve both the removal and the durable storage of the emissions that are captured, which is really critical for that long-term decrease in atmospheric emissions, which is ultimately what we're aiming for, right, in order to keep temperatures at the hospitable level for humanity. These carbon removal technologies are really interesting, and there's a whole world of scientific study, but I just wanted to highlight three examples because I think you'll find them pretty interesting. The first one is called direct air capture, and it's basically what it sounds like and what it looks like. It's a giant vacuum cleaner, and it sucks carbon dioxide right out of the air. After it catches the carbon, you can then bury it underground, or you can use it, use the captured carbon. You can sell it to soda companies for the bubbles, or to building materials companies who pump the captured carbon into things like concrete blocks. So direct air capture is super cool. The second example is enhanced rock weathering, which is one you may be less familiar with, but the concept here is that you sprinkle special crushed rocks on the ground or onto a farmer's field. And when the rain falls on the rocks, it helps to capture the carbon dioxide from the air. And then it travels via the water flow into the ground, basically speeding up the natural rock weathering process, which is the natural carbon cycle of the earth. And the third example is microalgae farming. So there are companies literally right now that are growing giant farms of microalgae with the sole intention of harvesting it and then burying it into the Sahara Desert. This is an actual company technology that's happening today. This is a real screenshot from a real farm. And the concept here is that microalgae doesn't need a lot to grow. Some water, some nutrients, some sun, and it captures carbon in its growth process, just like any other plant. And there's a huge amount of carbon captured per weight of algae. So you're creating these little carbon capture machines, and then you're burying them, again, enhancing the Earth's natural carbon cycle. If we think about all of the world's atmospheric greenhouse gases as being contained in a bathtub, we can think about the avoid and reduce projects as basically turning down the tap, putting less emissions into the atmosphere. Whereas in contrast, removal credits are equivalent to basically unplugging the drain and removing carbon already in the tub. So a bit simple, but I think it's a helpful way to think about these two types of projects. If we look a bit further into the costs associated right now, there's a really wide range just based on maturity, feasibility, technological readiness. So these are just kind of indicative pricings, but I wanted to give you a sense of scale. Starting on the left, there are the cheaper projects. These usually are the renewable generation projects, the cook stove projects, maybe reforestation could be down there as well. We can then think about $100 per ton as kind of a benchmark. The EU, European Union, has its own compliance-based emission trading scheme where they're selling credits basically based on their carbon trading system. And in 2023, that price hit $100 a ton for the first time. And these credits aren't necessarily generated from one specific type of project, but it indicates what the value of the removal or avoidance of carbon is these days. And then on the upper end of the scale, carbon offsets can cost over $1,000 per ton. These are usually the more novel removal technologies, highly expensive. They tend to be at the startup stage, but that number is expected to come down over time with investment. Back to this concept, though, of, well, how do we know what makes a good offset project? And the default answer to this is that in order to be robust, the offsetting project needs to have these four characteristics. It needs to be real, additional, measurable, and permanent. On the real side of things, I need to be able to go out into the forest and confirm that, yes, you're growing these trees and doing what you said you were going to do. It also needs to be additional, and additionality is a key concept in carbon offsetting. This refers to the fact that without additional financing through the sale of credits, this project never would have happened. So the project has to only be possible with this additional flow of money from companies who are ultimately going to offtake these credits. Third, the projects need to be measurable. So you actually need to be able to confirm what was the business as usual case? What would the carbon emissions from a business as usual pathway be? And against that baseline, you have the avoidance of a certain tonnage of carbon. And then the last characteristic is it needs to be permanent. And the question of permanence is interesting because in terms of what time scale does it need to be permanent? Is it something that you can confirm to be permanent for a human lifespan, for longer? There are different ways of thinking about permanence for different project types, and I won't get into it here, but that is the fourth and final characteristic. So in general, this RAMP acronym defines what a robust offsetting project looks like. And these RAMP criteria are then verified by verifying bodies. So I've listed a couple of them here, Vera, Gold Standard, there are a few others as well. When I introduced this slide, I mentioned that this is the default that people go to when defining good offsetting. But even offset projects that have met this robustness criteria and have been verified have come under scrutiny. So I snapped a couple of headlines from the last few years, analysis saying that certain carbon offsets are not additional or did not produce the benefits they said they would. There was a forest fire and it wiped out a whole swath of forest that Microsoft and BP had paid to protect and gotten offsets generated from the protection of those forests. So, in order to address this scrutiny, and the real problems that exist with offsetting, there is now kind of a revitalized movement to define good offsetting practices. And it's centered around the concept of high integrity projects. It's a real thing. The US federal government during the Biden administration put some efforts towards defining this. The European Union is doing the same. There are also recommendations from this new group called the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market. These have kind of risen from the in response to the scrutiny of the carbon market, and there is definitely more to come on this front. So what does this all mean for good offsetting practices? We know that offsetting should be secondary to direct reduction, but at the same time, climate scientists agree that some amount of carbon removal is needed. So it should be secondary, but not exclusive of offsetting. We also know that different project types have unique pros and cons. If you avoid logging a forest and it goes up in flames, that's a unique consideration and scenario compared to the risks associated with getting involved in a really expensive startup scale direct air capture project, for example. And then awareness of emerging guidance on this concept of high integrity credits should hopefully help guide companies to making purchasing decisions, though at the end of the day, it is a developing field and this concept of good is really still being fully defined. All right, what's next? We'll go through a brief summary of what we learned and what to expect going forward as well. So one of the biggest takeaways here is this concept of the three components of a good emission reduction target, which will lead you to the clear actions that need to be taken in order to formulate a target that you can feel good about. The first action is to measure your baseline. This will allow you to know where you're starting from and measure progress over time. The next one is to use SBTi's guidance to understand what percent reduction is needed as informed by climate science. And then lastly, set your target year and begin reducing emissions and track those reductions over time, which will more than likely require engaging your supply chain because you cannot do it alone. And then there was actually one more lesson we learned to complement the three components of a good emission reduction target, which is that offsetting can be used as a supplemental action, but not as a replacement for reductions. One call out that I want to make before I let you go is that at the time of recording this presentation, we're actually in the middle of SBTi's public consultation for version 2 of their guidance. So if you're interested, you can read the V2 consultation draft and provide comments by June 1st of this year. And you can find further details by following the link or scanning the QR code. Okay, so we learned today what makes a good emission reduction target, what makes it science-based, how can supply chain data support target achievement, how net zero differs from carbon neutral, and lastly, we learned about what good offsetting looks like. So thank you so much. You can find my contact information here. I'm always happy to have further conversations on this topic. And I hope you agree now that I can call myself Natalie Duncan. Thank you very much.